So, welcome everybody. This is our first Human Rights Network meeting for 2024. I'll do a fair bit of scene setting and just discussing through what we'll expect to work through today. We've got a pretty packed agenda, as always, but first I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands on which we're meeting. Now, I'm coming to you from Turrbal and Yagara land, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I really encourage you to pop in the chat if you'd like to acknowledge the lands from where you're dialing in from. We often have really great representation from this beautiful state of ours, from north to south to east to west, and encourage you to pop that in the chat there as you wish. I'd also like to acknowledge and any First Nations people that are joining us here today online, wherever you are coming from, and acknowledge the connection to land and sea that we have across this wonderful state. I do also like to, at this time of year, recognise that this is a difficult week and that we all, unite together and stand in solidarity together with all our First Nations colleagues, friends and family. Okay, folks, I do want to also just acknowledge, given the subject for today, in terms of the inquiry around supported accommodation, I know our wonderful friends at QDN have a lovely acknowledgement, just recognising people that do reside in institutional settings or supported accommodation settings, and recognise the advocacy and journey and support in their contexts. And lastly, I would like to just acknowledge for anyone dialing in from north of Brisbane, where I am today, that we have yet another significant weather event lapping at our shores, and certainly just hoping that everyone's staying safe and working together. I know it's quite a big impact on our community and the role that our sector plays in working together. Thank you for those that are popping their acknowledgements in the chat. That's always really nice to see. It's greatly appreciated. Now, I do just want to touch as well that we do or should have closed captions set up for those that would like to access that part of things. If you are having any problems with that, please let us know, and the wonderful team pulling the strings behind me will be able to set that up. So I will try not to talk too much. We've got some wonderful presenters here, and then really keen to hear from you and have some great discussion. You should have the agenda in front of you on your screen now. So I'll run through a bit of context setting, and then we'll start to move on to hear from John Chesterman from the Public Advocate and Matilda Alexander from Queensland Advocacy for Inclusion. We'll then move to a discussion point. My wonderful colleague Bronwyn will lead us through that section, where we'll talk about the supported accommodation inquiry that will, is just next week, I believe, that is going to be set up. Then we'll break into some breakout rooms. It wouldn't be a QCOSS networking event online without some wonderful breakout rooms and a chance for you to chat to each other and really talk about what this network's going to look like over 2024. And then my other wonderful colleague, Lauren, will be talking about some of the upcoming inquiries and things on the horizon. No doubt this will be another busy year for all of us in the space of community services and advocacy. You may or may not be aware that it's an election year, and that always dials up a bit of the heat, I think, for us, both in terms of challenges that come along, but also opportunities for making some real change and impact. So firstly, if this is your first Human Rights Network meeting, welcome. It's lovely to have you here. For those that are returning, welcome as well. I just want to touch on a bit of the purpose and process for this network. So this has been running for a little while now. There's been some amazing work in understanding and networking and sharing information when it comes to human rights and how that applies in the context of our communities and our sector. This network's really about being participatory. So it's really about sharing the expertise from across the lands and across the different organisations that you represent. We tend to, in this space, have people that are very well versed in human rights, very well practiced, have been to a lot of these sessions and bring a wealth of knowledge and information into these conversations. And we have some people that may be, emerging practitioners or quite new to the space. And that's really what we want, that nice mix of expertise and experience. And so we really encourage you throughout this session and throughout the year to engage with the process as much as you are feeling comfortable to do within your comfort zones. We'll have the chat section there that you can use at any point during this session, whether it's questions, comments, or resources. And we will encourage you at times, if you do have other questions, to take yourself off mute and jump in as well. We should have quite a large group with us today, so that always will keep me on my toes in terms of facilitating and keeping us all moving. But we really want to hear as much from you and your voice and as little of my voice as possible. In terms of any other context setting, just a reminder that, this network is predominantly for people in the community services sector, but we do have some friends and colleagues that join us from government organisations as well. And the whole idea is around discussing learning and really having a safe space to share information. So we both encourage you to be bold and brave in sharing with your peers, but also having sensitive discussions and obviously respecting each other as we go as well. There have been some questions that we had sent through around both some of this topic and the Human Rights Network moving forward. I just want to acknowledge those questions there. Some of those we'll be able to touch on today and others we'll address over time, and encourage you, if you do have any feedback or thoughts, that we do have the humanrights@qcoss.org.au email there to send any of those queries, pearls of wisdom, anything like that. Now, we are recording today's session. That's primarily in the hope that we can, for future use the presentations, and we'll be using that as well to make sure that we're continually improving as we go through the year in this network and future networks. Okie dokie. I think I have ticked all the boxes of my scene setting. Apologies if I haven't. It is still January, and I do have a newborn at home that's slowly depleting my number of brain cells to be sharp and with you today. Bronwyn, if we can move to the next slide, I'll start to address the topic and introduce our speakers. So this is quite an important topic today. I worked for many years in direct service delivery, supporting individuals that reside in different levels of supported accommodation. It's something that I have quite a personal interest in. It's a real privilege to be a part of this conversation today. I'm assuming that all of you joining us here today have some experience in that sector, or working with individuals that are in there, or representing advocacy organisations. And my personal belief is that this is a very, very important area to be advocating for change and support, and how we can provide suitable and supported accommodation for some of our most vulnerable Queenslanders. And it's a great pleasure to have some amazing speakers here today that are going to set us off on the course of this discussion. So as I mentioned, we have John Chesterman from the Public Advocate for Queensland and Matilda Alexander from Queensland Advocacy for Inclusion. John, I'm going to pass to you first, ask you to introduce yourself and set us off on this lovely webinar. Thanks, folks.
Great, thanks very much, Ryan, and good morning to everyone. It's nice to see some familiar faces just on the small number of people that I can see. I can see Natalie and others. So great to be here with you. And Ryan, you've done well to be here with a newborn at home. I'm impressed. And thanks for your introduction. So I'll begin with some slides. The next slide, I'll begin by acknowledging that I'm on the, similar to Ryan, I'm on the traditional lands of the Yaggara and Turrbal peoples, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Next slide, please, Bronwyn. I'll just give you an overview of what I do as the Queensland Public Advocate. I've been in the role now for more than 2 years, which surprised me because I still feel fresh. And I was formerly Deputy Public Advocate in Victoria prior to that. And I can say our topic of supported accommodation, this is a big issue in Victoria before I come up here. So as Public Advocate, I've just got there a list of the topics of which I've been focused on in my 2.5 years here. Better regulation of restrictive practices in aged care and disability services. Interestingly, you'll know there's new aged care legislation out in an exposure draft form. I've just written an article on that. I think it's lacking in terms of its brief mention of restrictive practices. That's an Australian Ageing Agenda this week, if you're interested. Other topics I've worked on: removal of the ban on people with an impairment of the mind from having sexual relationships. That's still in our criminal code, bizarrely. Improving our prevention of and responses to elder abuse. Written a report on the acute mental health system, a report on removing the default confidentiality requirement in our guardianship system, on OPCAT compliance, that's optional protocol on the Convention Against Torture. I've written a 2-volume report on adult safeguarding. I'm advocating for the harmonisation across all states and territories of financial enduring powers of attorney. That sounds very dry. It's actually an important elder abuse initiative. And then, of course, today, supported accommodation. Next slide, please, Bronwyn. So the report that I'm talking about today, that was completed in August, is this one: Safe, Secure and Affordable, the need for an inquiry into supported accommodation in Queensland. The reason I worked on this report was during the adult safeguarding work that I undertook, which involved roundtables throughout the state, this issue kept coming up of supported accommodation, particularly level 3 residential services and other comparable accommodation settings. And as I say, I was in Victoria previously, and this is a big issue in Victoria. And you'll know from the Disability Royal Commission that, in fact, the Royal Commission devoted 11 pages of its final report to in Victoria, they're called supported residential services. Here, the equivalent is level 3 residential services, but to this topic and the regulation of this area, which is somewhat problematic for reasons I'll go into. Next slide, please, Bronwyn. The reason for undertaking this report, and the key issues that I wanted to flag in writing the report, and I thank very much my staff member Jacinta, who was integral to writing the report, and Tracy, the office manager. So they've both been integral to the writing of this report. Well, when I refer to my report, I mean the office report. So the key issues: the changing and high-level support needs of residents. It's routinely said that the needs of residents in this sector are changing and more high-level, particularly in relation to unmet psychosocial support needs. But I want to ask that question, and that's one of the reasons for writing the report. Another point is, as you would know, the state regulation of level 3 residential services occurs through a housing frame primarily, rather than a social care one, which again I think is problematic. And thirdly, there is an extraordinarily complex entanglement of local, state and federal regulations that apply. And I'll show you a slide about that in a second. And so the point being, we need to make sure that the housing and support needs of our most at-risk citizens are being met, and that services being provided to them are well regulated. And many of the residents of supported accommodation settings I would identify as being at-risk citizens in one way or another. That's a term actually that I use now, similar to the Australian Law Reform Commission's recommendations. I use that rather than referring just to people with disability or older people or whatever. I use at-risk citizens as the preferred terminology. So the regulatory complexity, if we go to the next slide, Bob, and I'm not asking you to look at this slide in any great detail, but simply to make the point of how complex the regulatory environment is. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But we've got 3 levels of government, from local, state and federal, that are regulating everything from health, food standards to the actual requirements for level 3 services, right through to NDIS support. And the NDIS is a big reason for this report and the subsequent inquiry. So the next slide, please, Bronwyn, just shows I had simply one recommendation in my report, which was that there should be a parliamentary inquiry into the provision and regulation of supported accommodation in Queensland. And in suggesting that, I raised 29 questions in my report, which I suggested guide the parliamentary inquiry, as well as 2 overarching ones that I mentioned in my forward. So we go to the next slide. I'm very pleased that the government agreed to that recommendation, and that inquiry is up and running at the moment. And you'll see there the terms of reference refer specifically to my office's report and the 29 questions raised in that report. So, as I say, the Community Services and Support Committee, the Parliamentary Committee, is up and running. I gave evidence to it on the 18th of December. It's calling for submissions until the 3rd of February and is due to report on or before the 22nd of March. Very importantly, it's worth saying the committee has adopted my suggestion, which was to engage an NGO, and in fact it's engaged 2 NGOs, QAI, and you'll hear from Matilda in a minute, and QDN, to gain the views of current and former residents. So that's a key part of the inquiry process. And I might just say, in parenthesis that sets a new benchmark, in my view, for the work of parliamentary committees in this state, that they're going to that level of getting the views of current and previous supported accommodation residents. Okay, I want to take you through some of the key questions on the next slide, please, Bronwyn. Some of the key questions that are foundational ones for this report. Firstly, what is supported accommodation? It sounds obvious, but often here in Queensland a shorthand for level 3 residential services. So we've got 42 of those registered providers in Queensland with the maximum bed capacity of just under 1,500 beds. I note early on though, and I've raised this in my report, that I use the term supported accommodation a bit more broadly, not just to refer to level 3 residential services as defined in the particular legislation here in Queensland, but other shared living arrangements, including what we call level 1 and 2 services. So level 1 is room, level 2 is food, level 3 is personal care, such as assistance with medication and showering and laundry and so on. But I use that term sometimes. People in level 1 or receiving level 1 and level 2 services, really what you might call in supported accommodation settings, because they're getting their support through NDIS funding, and this is part of the complexity, and I'll come to that in a moment. The second point there, human rights. The human rights implications of the regulation and possible reform of the sector are worth noting. My report notes that it directly engages with many of the human rights of residents that are articulated amongst other places in our Human Rights Act and in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So these include things like the right to receive an adequate standard of living, adequate food and housing, to be involved in decisions that affect them, to be free from exploitation and violence, and to choose their place of residence and with whom they live. I mentioned in my evidence too to the Parliamentary Committee, there's a question about, are supported accommodation settings institutions as such, and are they consistent with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities provisions around people not living in institutions? I mentioned to the Parliamentary Committee, and many people online would know this, that in some supported accommodation settings, bedrooms and or bathrooms are shared, and in some cases very large common kitchen and dining areas are shared with others, which give institutions certainly a very institutional feel. So some level 3 residential services arguably do fit within the definition of institutional in contravention of Article 19 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I also note in my report, my office's report, that the number of residents within a particular facility and the ability of residents to meaningfully choose their own accommodation setting and the services they receive, that's integral, in my view, determining whether they're in an institutional setting or not. Third dot point there, future of level 3 regulatory category. The reason I raise this is largely because of the NDIS. So because of the NDIS, we now have the situation where some people who otherwise might be recipients of level 3 residential services, so those services to assist in their medication management and their personal care support, can now be supported with NDIS funding in many of those services. So this means that one person, and indeed many people, sometimes even all people living on a site which is registered to provide level 3 services, there's actually few people receiving level 3 services. They're receiving level 1 and 2 services and getting NDIS funded support, either from the accommodation provider or sometimes a very closely aligned entity. So this obviously creates extraordinary regulatory complexity because the NDIS is regulated federally, nationally, whereas level 3 services are regulated at state level. So who has oversight of the whole picture? At the moment, nobody. The last point there, transitional or long term, it's another preliminary question about whether we ought to see, for instance, people living in level 3 accredited residential services as being there for a short time or longer term. I won't go into that in any detail here, but I also note that I do raise that as a question. I also note that there's debate about whether people in level 3 residential services ought to be seen as homeless, technically. The reason why that's an important question is because if they are homeless, then they would be entitled to access homeless support services, and if they're not...
In the meeting, no, you're waiting. So it must be a different link to the one I had in... Anyway, I'm here now. Thank you.
Sorry, that was just a contribution, not from me. We'll press on. Since finalising my report, the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of People with Disability has released its final report. It's made a particular recommendation amongst the 222 recommendations. I point you to recommendation 7.38, which deals with supported accommodation settings and calls for a number of reforms that I'll refer to in a moment. Today, I thought I'd flag, if we go to the next slide, please, Bronwyn, just the 5 areas that I think are important when it comes to immediate reforms. When I gave evidence to the Parliamentary Committee on the 18th of December, they asked me what are my top five priorities, and I had to take that on notice because I could think of a lot of issues where I thought there were reforms needed, but coming up with the top 5, I wanted to take away. So these are the 5 I've come back with. And in fact, I've since put in a submission to the parliamentary inquiry, making 9 suggested recommendations, but these are the top 5. I'll go through them as sector census. So first, I think there needs to be a wide-ranging census of the current support needs and provision of services to supported accommodation residents. I think that's really important. We need to know the nature of the disability and other support needs of residents, the number of residents who are current NDIS participants, and the number who are actually receiving level 3 services. Second point, we need person-centred regulation. As I say, the current regulation is focused on a housing frame. We need to focus on the individual and the services being received by the individual, whether those services are state regulated or federally regulated under the NDIS. We need someone to have oversight, a regulator to have oversight of the services being received by the person. Independent, and just on that, I might just say the Disability Royal Commission recommendation includes a recommendation, or the key recommendation for us is it recommends that there be support plans for each resident in Queensland level 3 residential services and equivalents in other states and territories. So I echo that call in my recommendation on person-centred regulation. The third dot point, independent assessments. I think there needs to be independent assessments of all the service needs of all new residents of level 3 services, and probably every 2 years, an assessment of the current needs of residents in level 3 residential services and comparable settings. 4, and I'm just going to finish up on these, 4, case management. It's very important, I think, for some supported accommodation residents who currently have significant unmet support needs to be able to receive case management services. So this would involve supporting a person to get adequate services, and it may also involve assisting a person to move to a different accommodation setting where that's what they would like to do. But the criterion for access to case management I've suggested is that a person has significant unmet support needs. Then finally, and the last point I'll finish on, government investment. A strong case can be made for greater investment by the Queensland Government in the supported accommodation sector, which could involve a range of activities from the purchase of entire sites and the engagement of contracted support agencies right through to support for capital works on existing structures that would enable, for instance, residents to have their own bathrooms and showering facilities. There are a number of other reforms that I could address, including adult safeguarding, information sharing, the role of community visitors, and the need for a supported accommodation regulator, which is something I've recommended in my submission to the parliamentary inquiry, which has just got in, I think, 5 days ago. But I won't go through any of those now, and I'll leave it to Matilda to take up the baton. Thanks very much for your attention. I think I'm right on time. I'll stop there, and I'm very happy to engage with people later on. I'm very interested to hear people's thoughts. Thanks, Ryan and Bronwyn.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. So much there, and so much work to do. I think I really liked the tone you said at the beginning in terms of that benchmark of the role of NGOs involved in this inquiry. I certainly hope that is a benchmark we can keep high as we move through, no doubt, lots of inquiries coming into lots of different parts of our sector. Now, we did have a slide there around questions and comments. I'm just going to hand over to Matilda first. I think I'll walk through her presentation, and then perhaps we can have some discussion from there. I do encourage you, though, to pop any questions in the chat. I can see there's a bit of experience there being shared, and really keen for you, if there are any things out of that presentation that John just gave, or as Matilda's speaking, please chuck them in there and I'll make sure I'll address them before we open up to a bit of broader conversation. So Matilda, I will hand to you, welcome you to chat to the group. I can see Bronwyn's just setting up the presentation there. We should be good to go.
Thank you very much for having me, and I would like to also acknowledge that I am coming to you today from Jagera and Turrbal lands, and pay my respect to elders past and present, and to any traditional owners here today, and acknowledging the stories, traditions and cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on this land. QAI commits to building a brighter future together and to addressing racism and injustice. So QAI, Queensland Advocacy for Inclusion, is a not-for-profit advocacy organisation and specialist community legal centre for people with disability. We advocate for attitudinal law and policy change, as well as doing individual advocacy with people, including mental health law, human rights law, justice support in the criminal justice system, as has been mentioned, providing support to people to tell their story to this parliamentary inquiry. We do NDIS appeals advocacy, youth advocacy, education advocacy, and we also coordinate a statewide network of disability advocates and have a statewide hotline for disability advocacy in Queensland. QAI has been looking at the issue of supported accommodation for a really long time, ever since our origins more than 35 years ago. We think it's vitally important to the work that we do. And I'm sure if you can imagine spending all day, every day, lacking the choice and control over aspects of your life, you'd understand why. Imagine having no say in who shares your living space, what you're going to eat for breakfast and lunch or dinner or snacks. You cannot decide when you will eat, what activities fill your day, even what TV program you watch or book you are going to read. You have to go to bed every night at 7 p.m. despite not being tired. These are the kind of things that we see in institutional environments, including in some supported accommodation. So in 1988, it was estimated that there were 7,500 people with intellectual disability residing in large state or private residential centres and psychiatric hospitals throughout Australia. By 1999, this number had halved to 4,340 people living in institutional accommodation. We saw, because of campaigns from places like Queensland Advocacy for Inclusion, we saw the closure of large state-based institutions in Queensland, like the Challoner Centre and Basil Stafford Centre. And here are some of the posters that QAI had at protests against these large institutions. So things like quotes from residents saying the handles were taken off the toilet doors and the knobs were taken off so you couldn't, the taps, so you couldn't go to the toilet. Yeah, so these were really grassroots campaigns involving people and reaching out to people in supported accommodation. So it led to the closure of these large institutions. It has also been, with closing those institutions by themselves was somewhat problematic in the way that it was done, because there wasn't enough investment in community-based support. So we need to ensure that deinstitutionalisation is not just about closing one option and leaving a gap. It's about building community-based supports. Otherwise, you end up with re-institutionalisation in prisons and a growth of homelessness. So while QAI has always advocated for deinstitutionalisation, we need to do it right in order to ensure rights are protected. So today we have a situation where we have these supported accommodation providers. There are about 44 of those in Queensland, and they are doing that level 3 personal care, food, accommodation, the all-in-one supports. So that's what this parliamentary inquiry is looking at, that John mentioned. And the Disability Royal Commission made a number of recommendations, recommendation 7.38, calling for reform, calling for support plans. Now, while it was good to see the Disability Royal Commission final report, we also think it's really important to go back to the foundational documents that informed that report. And I'd like to highlight the one particular research report in the lead up to that final report, which said this quote here. So it said, congregated accommodation settings, for example, institutions, hostels and boarding house-like facilities need to be closed. They are unsafe and unable to deliver on the expectations of and obligations imposed by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the objectives of the National Disability Insurance Scheme Act. So very clear wording from that research report, perhaps even more clear than in the final report recommendations. There was Queensland Disability Network did a small sample of who is actually living in supported accommodation. They did they only looked at really just a handful of people, but that handful revealed the level of vulnerability in that cohort, so in that community. So so the number of people who are at risk, who are vulnerable, who are disadvantaged, whatever one of those words you're using, what's been identified is that there is a real, I guess, invisible funnel in society where you see at the top the people with most advantage, the people who are economically advantaged, and plus every other kind of privilege, having a range of different places that they can choose to live. You can get a mansion on the beach, you can do a range of different things, and from that level of ultimate privilege comes down the funnel, right down to people who are experiencing the most disadvantage, the most vulnerability, the most at risk, and they are the people who end up in supported accommodation because they have no other choices. So we see, so this small study saw that 90% of the people living in supported accommodation had the DSP, 50% were on NDIS, 50% had lived there for over 5 years. So if we're seeing these kind of institutionalized environments as being, it's just a short-term option, that's actually not how they're being used at the moment. They're being used, people are really getting there and getting stuck there. And part of it is what John was talking about. They're not defined as homeless anymore. So they're not eligible for, priority housing. They're not eligible on governmental, they're seen as accommodated, whereas really institutionalization is not accommodation. Not all supported accommodation places would meet the definition of institutions, but certainly they're at huge risk of doing that. 70% of the people also in this study had schizophrenia, which was an interesting correlation. There was a huge history of unemployment, homelessness, domestic and family violence, health issues, imprisonment, disability, drug use, and trauma within this community. The issues that they were facing were the issues typical of people experiencing all of those risks, all of those vulnerabilities and disadvantage. There was a lack of accountability for anything that was going on in there. There was a criminalisation of the care that they were being provided with. So if I'm at home and I punch a hole in the wall, I'm not getting a willful damage charge. Criminalisation of care talks about the way that people who are in care environments are criminalised for things that we wouldn't get criminalised for at home. There's a huge issue with commercial profitability. These are for-profit environments, which creates numerous conflicts of interest between people's rights. So the cheaper you can do the food, the more profit you're going to make. But that's not necessarily how you and I might be able to choose to eat at home. There's a lack of access to bail or parole accommodation for supported accommodation. You can't put in a parole application. It takes 6 months for a parole application to be heard. So you can't put in that you're going to a supported accommodation because they can't hold that place for 6 months. An understanding of rights and ability to exercise rights for those residents, the access that they have to a drop-in centre at a community legal centre or to information is very limited. access to health and other services, including preventative health. How can you get from a supported accommodation to a dentist for a 6-monthly checkup? There are numerous barriers in being able to do so. OPG, the Office of the Public Guardian, visitors do visit these places, but they don't necessarily capture systemic issues or have systemic reporting on the causes of deaths in them. And a large proportion of people's income is often spent on rent. So their DSP, up to 80% of their DSP can be spent on the rent, because the rent includes the accommodation and food. So it leaves people with very little left to go on. And as John talked about here, I've got the next slide is taken from John's report. And I guess in addition to what he was saying, I think that this demonstrates why, even though there is a raft of different regulation, there's nothing that actually takes a person and says, where do you want to be? Is this what's working for you? Not just, is your food, go over here and talk about, is your food okay? Go over here and talk about, there's rats in your room. Go over here and talk about your personal support person isn't cleaning you properly. There's no one to really combine all of that together. And more importantly, there's no one to really say, how do we get you out of here? All of these things, you could be in a nice clean room and getting enough food for nutrition. It still doesn't mean that an institutional environment is okay. And who is responsible for getting you out? Making sure it's not a long-term solution if it's not meant to be that. And all of this comes down to human rights, and human rights are not about just the basic, making sure the room's clean, food's okay. The United Nations have been very clear on deinstitutionalization. So QAI and myself and our team, including I can see Alex here, went over to the United Nations last year and the year before, and part of what we were doing was working on developing these guidelines for deinstitutionalization, which have now been published by the United Nations. Now, these guidelines, really, we need to be reiterating these at every opportunity, because now this is a UN document. It says, it defines what institutionalization is. So an obligatory sharing of assistance with others, and no or limited influence over who provides the assistance. Isolation and segregation from independent life in the community. Lack of control over day-to-day decisions. Lack of choice for individuals concerned with whom they live. Rigidity of routine, irrespective of personal will and preference. Identical activities in the same place for a group of individuals under a certain authority. A paternalistic approach in service provision. Supervision of living arrangements, and a disproportionate number of persons with disability in the same environment. So it's using that United Nations definition that means that I am referring to a large number of supported accommodation providers. Currently, a large number of those 44 accommodation providers in Queensland would meet that UN definition of institutionalisation. Now, this is very important, because when we're talking, so the UN says we should get rid of all institutions for people with disability. It doesn't say we should keep some as short-term accommodation. It doesn't say we should keep them as a safety net. So if we're talking about government investment, are we talking about government investment in more institutions, or are we talking about saying government investment should only be in community-based solutions that don't meet this UN definition? So the UN guidelines go on to say the institutionalisation of persons with disability refers to any detention based on disability alone or in conjunction with other grounds such as care or treatment. Disability-specific detention typically includes institutions that are but not limited to social care institutions, psychiatric institutions, hospitals, nursing homes, secure dementia wards, special boarding houses, rehabilitation centres, halfway homes, group homes, sheltered or protected living homes, psychiatric settings, transit homes, and congregated settings. So there's a range of different words that are used in to describe institutions around the world. And so that's what this document is trying to do, is saying, regardless of what you call it, a rose is a rose and it is an institution. And it says they should all be shut down. And they say the absence or reform or removal of one or more institutional elements cannot be used to characterize a setting suddenly as community-based. So, for example, in settings where adults with disability continue to be subjected to substitute decision-making or compulsory treatment, where they share assistance, or where they're in the community but have a set routine and deny autonomy, or homes where the same service provider packages housing and support together. So that is explicitly, that is reading from the international guidelines, but it could just as well be an Australian thing. I mean, the Disability Royal Commission really talked a lot about accommodation providers where the package, where your NDIS package is linked in with your accommodation package. Now, the reason why the UN is calling for an end to all of this is because of the abuse, and that's the same reason why the Disability Royal Commission called for an end to it, and the NDIS review also touched on it. So we've got all of these human rights elements saying the same thing. We need to end the institutionalisation of people with disability. Now, the UN guidelines really talk about how do you end that as well. So how do you deinstitutionalise? How do you involve people with disability in that process? How do you respect individual will and preference? Build community-based support, allocate funding and resources, not to more institutions, but to community-based accessible housing. So we've got, on one level, we've got that United Nations human rights, and on the next level, we've got Queensland law. So we've got a Human Rights Act here. It talks relevantly about the right to privacy, the right to freedom of movement and association, the right to protection of families and children, cultural rights, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rights, and the right to health services and education. So all of those rights are in our Queensland law and can be actioned right now. So these are really relevant for people living in supported accommodation. On the next slide, QAI has created a poster that's going to be distributed around supported accommodation in Queensland. This lets people know that they have rights. So the right to be heard, the right to make a complaint, the right to access healthcare, the right to control your money. I'll just pop a link to the chat in the chat to that poster in case you have somewhere that you can helpfully distribute that rights-based poster, and directs people to call our 1-800 number for further information. On the next slide, we have some information about the parliamentary inquiry. It's the first time I've actually ever heard of a parliamentary inquiry going this deep, not just sitting in Parliament House and holding half a day worth of listening to whoever can make it to them, but actually physically, they are physically going out to supported accommodation providers. They are physically entering institutions, walking around in there, saying who wants to come and talk to us. The actual politicians are doing that, who are part of the inquiry. I've just never seen anything like that. And also giving us funding and QDN funding to make sure that residents feel safe and supported in telling their stories, and to help them to have some accountability and safety around doing that, and doing that in disability wear in an appropriate way. I mean, I think that if every parliamentary inquiry, like if they're talking about youth justice, they went into the youth prison and funded the people working with the young people to actually help tell their stories. Imagine what a different what a different inquiry it would be. So I think that we should really be, this is the gold standard of what I've seen in parliamentary inquiries, and we should be advocating for it more broadly. But in the meantime, yeah, please. So the 2nd of February is like in 9 days' time. So we need to get everybody's stories, get the parliamentary inquiry, to hear about former residents, family members, as well as anybody who's in there. We want them to hear the nitty-gritty, the detail of what is happening in supported accommodation in Queensland, so that we can work together to build a better future for people with disabilities and for all people living in these environments. Thank you. And just my last slide is our contact details if you want to know more about QAI.
Thank you so much, Matilda. It's a real privilege to have yourself and John here in terms of your experience and understanding. I loved in your presentation that there's something really important, I think, about this particular subject, but lots of our advocacy in Queensland around the history and story there. I remember back to some of my earlier days having the privilege of meeting someone who, as a young person, was in Woolston Park back in the 80s and sharing their experience and stories. And so some of that still resonates with me today, 10, 11 years later, in terms of understanding where we've come from. And there's some really important lessons, I think, here in understanding how that shift of government policy affects different people's lives and outcomes in terms of deinstitutionalization being so very needed, but then the next steps of where those resources go and what that investment does and how we don't just, cut off one thing that's not working very well and is having these really traumatic influences and not providing an alternative solution. I think there's such valuable lessons here. And I do love hearing the resonance there between both of your statements of the depth of this inquiry. I know certainly for myself, I had heard a lot of different stories from talking to people who were residing in supported accommodation, but going there and experiencing it for yourself, I'm sure anyone in the room here who has that experience, and I know that we have a lot of experience in the room here, seeing it for yourself is a very different experience, I think. Lastly, before I hand over to all of you and to Bronwyn to lead us through some discussion, I do want to recognise the phrase of nothing about us without us that QDN does advocate for, and just want to acknowledge that we don't here in the session today have anyone at least identified as a speaker with a lived experience of residing in supported accommodation. I do want to recognise that and understand that the value and importance of hearing those stories, and again want to recognise how good it is to hear that there is those stories being told in a safe way and captured through this inquiry, because I really recognise all of your experience and everyone here today as advocates and community sector workers, but making sure we're really keeping our focus on that person-centred understanding of people's experience and stories.